Yeah, so as part of the filing on the 10K, they're actually public companies are going to be required to file a statement about what they do. How do they protect the organization in terms of cybersecurity? So I'd say a great place to start is the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. That's the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. And they have a framework around identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover.
Welcome to the podcast. Today we're diving deep into a topic that's crucial for every board member out there: cybersecurity training for a board of directors. We'll go into the critical questions that boards should be asking their CEOs and, just as importantly, themselves to ensure that their organization's cyber defenses are up to the mark. We'll also touch on the often overlooked aspect of cybersecurity liability for boards and what that means to be proactive in understanding and mitigating security risks. I'd like to welcome our expert, Ann Westerheim. She's the CEO of Ikaru, a managed service provider in the greater Boston area. She's going to unpack what boards need to know. Welcome, Ann.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Raj. I'm really excited to talk about cybersecurity and boards of directors today.
Yeah, so let's talk about this in terms of the imperative for boards. Why does cybersecurity training, and more broadly, cybersecurity as a whole, need to be a priority for a board of directors? Why not just leave it to a CEO?
Well, the CEO certainly has operational responsibility for cybersecurity in all aspects of the business, but boards have fiduciary responsibility for the property, for the money, whether there's investors or other stakeholders in the organization. They also have a seat at the table and a responsibility to best serve everyone that they represent. They're trusted to be in this role, and cybersecurity is a big part of what they need to be focused on.
Yeah, and so and cybersecurity changes all the time, so the board really needs to be up to speed on what's going on in the industry in case the company that they're a fiduciary for gets attacked. So, how can boards ensure that their organizations are prepared to face the cybersecurity challenges that are out there?
Yeah, so a couple of different aspects of this. One, for public companies, the SEC has come out with rulings that are very specific. Boards need to file the 8K. If there is a material cybersecurity incident, they'll need to file for that. They also need to file the 10K, which is part of their annual filing to say what's their cybersecurity program as a whole. Now that applies to public companies, and there's some different guidelines, but that's all going to work through its system because even nonprofit boards, other boards have fiduciary responsibility for the organization that they're working with.
Can you elaborate on those two? Are those like forms, processes, things like that that they need to file in addition to something else, or is it just part of the general course of their
Yeah, so
filings?
for public companies, the SEC oversees everything that's happening with them, and there's very strict guidelines for a number of different things. The concept is that a cybersecurity incident is just as material as, if a factory burned down, that has implications for customers, for profitability, et cetera. Same thing is if there's a major cybersecurity incident, that could disrupt operations, impact the stock price, et cetera, impact customers. So that's
Hmm.
why they've made this ruling, but there's like a lot of regulations that apply to public boards. And I think that anybody involved with a private board ought to be looking at that because the same philosophy holds true.
Okay, let's talk about best practices framework. So what would you recommend to to a board of directors for cybersecurity training to create some sort of governance framework?
Yeah, so as part of the filing on the 10K, they're actually public companies are going to be required to file a statement about what they do in terms of, how do they protect the organization in terms of cybersecurity. So I'd say a great place to start is the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. That's the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. And they have a framework around identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And that's a great way to just look at the overall cybersecurity landscape. So first, identify, run an assessment. Where is the company at right now? And an honest assessment, what are the weaknesses? What are the strengths? What are all the different technology components and data components that need to be protected? Then what is the organization doing to protect? Identify, for example, you can have great protection in place. Nothing is 100% secure. It's not possible. If something goes through, what are you doing in terms of detection? Then respond, looking at logs, et cetera, and then recover. Every company is specifically required to have a disaster recovery plan. So all boards should be discussing this right now, whether they're public or private. And just that simple framework to start a conversation is a great place to be. Don't get overwhelmed by all the different terminology and acronyms and all that. Just identify, detect, respond, and recover. And that gets the conversation going.
So, in a public company, the boards may be comprised of people with quite varying backgrounds. Some may have more exposure to cybersecurity than others. So, in terms of cybersecurity training for a board of directors, what would be the first steps that a company like Icaro, somebody like you, would take if a public company came to you and said, "Can you get all of our team members up to speed?" What's the first, second, third steps to make sure that that cybersecurity training for the board of directors is what they need?
Well, I strongly believe that creating a culture of cybersecurity really starts at the top. And the days of like throwing the responsibility over to the fence to the technology department or to a different group, that no longer flies. So ongoing security awareness training for everybody in the organization is a must have. All cyber insurance policies require that now. You're going to have to demonstrate the Massachusetts data security law has required that for, I think that's been in effect for 14 years at this point, and learning the basics. So, as far as from what I've read in the SEC guidelines, companies aren't specifically required to have a cybersecurity expert on the board, but they are required to say how they are getting trained, how they're getting advice, what are their sources of advice, etc. And in this day and age, you can hardly read the news without seeing a new cybersecurity event. So this just impacts everybody. There's no escaping it. It's not going to go away. There's a lot of money in cybercrime, and criminals are going to keep committing those crimes. So, setting that example, for example, just doing simulated phishing tests among people. A lot of times executives want to be excluded from that. They don't want to be embarrassed, but really setting that example that we're all in this together. We need to build a culture of security awareness. In Verizon's data breach investigations report that they come out with every year, 74% of cyber incidents involve a human factor, somebody clicking on a link. So it's really not something you can just set aside for one department. It really requires everyone's participation and show that leadership from the top.
So you touched on the fiduciary responsibility of a board. Uh, how should boards oversee the cybersecurity risk management profile of a company? What would they do for the oversight? And should there be a cybersecurity dashboard for a board of directors?
Yeah, I think so. A cybersecurity dashboard's kind of an interesting concept because it lets you maybe visualize everything that's going on. So again, it's going to be based on a cybersecurity framework, but you can quickly see where you're at. So in the 10K filings, boards are going to have to, or companies are going to have to submit how they're going to oversee this. They may put cybersecurity in, say, they may have a technology committee. The audit committee will have to audit what is being done for cybersecurity also. And that's where a dashboard can really help because you can quickly visualize where you're at, fill in the check boxes, where are the weaknesses. You can see that pretty quickly. But definitely boards can be structured in different ways, but generally there's going to be an audit committee and they would be auditing whether there's a cybersecurity committee or a technology committee, wherever that ends up falling, they're going to have to oversee that as well with the audit.
What kind of cybersecurity risks or issues should be reported to a board?
So every company should have in place a cybersecurity incident response plan. Like, what are you going to do if an event hits? Then the question is what the SEC says, and this relates to the public companies, is that material risks or material events have to be reported. So now you need to document what exactly is a material risk. And that is, so companies will have to define that in a reasonable way. So, for example, one of the early ones just this year, because the new laws went into effect, Microsoft filed an 8K for an incident they had with some internal emails. And the description was pretty general. It was interesting because a lot of people kind of read through the lines, but some mailboxes were actually accessed and data was exfiltrated, but they wrote it up as a very small percentage of mailboxes or a small percentage of files. But where some of the debate came in is these were some key, top level people. So yes, it was a small percentage, but it was some key top level people. And also interesting in there, they talked about how it happened via password spray, which means they probably did not have multi-factor authentication on these systems. So you can read a lot more into it, but I applaud them because they followed the rules. That was one of the first ones out there, major company, and they reasonably wrote it up. And they also point out, as we all know, that they face risks that everybody faces. Every individual, every business faces the same risks. But material was data accessed. Also in their 8K filing, they go on to say that no other systems were compromised in this. It was a pretty limited thing, and that if they discovered after the fact that it was more broad, that they would report on that as well. But so defining material, was data access, was any private PII information impacted, was any data exfiltrated? Those are things that would be material.
Okay. This is all pretty critical stuff because, when you think about Microsoft being able to get attacked like that, and we hear about other large companies, Equifax, there's so many, the list goes on. There's nobody that's immune. And that brings up the issue of liability. Can you talk about the kind of liability that boards face when it comes to cybersecurity and overall corporate cyber risk?
Yeah, so boards with their fiduciary responsibility will have liability for cybersecurity risk. And there's been lawsuits in the past. Yahoo had a major breach many, many years ago. There was a major lawsuit against that. Target had a major cybersecurity event. There was a shareholder lawsuit against that because, the risks that the company faces, they could lose customers, lose revenue, lose reputation. Those can be very expensive to rebuild. Another competitor can pick up a lot of the business. Investors can be harmed by this. So, corporations will have cyber insurance. Typically, directors also have executive and officer insurance as well. So the directors will
Mhm.
be protected, need to have that insurance in place. But in the case if it's proven that they acted irresponsibly, then that's liability on the board. And that's where insurance may come into play to help offset some of that financial impact. But fiduciary responsibility is a serious thing. Others are trusting you to protect the assets.
Yeah. What questions should then a board of directors ask a CEO, or question in general? Like maybe it's not just the CEO, maybe it's the CTO of the organization. So what questions should they be asking about their cybersecurity readiness?
I think, again, looking at that NIST framework,
Hmm.
is there a coherent map of all the data, all the technology systems that are in the organization? So for example, just very, very simply, security patching, right? We all Microsoft, Patch Tuesday, we're all very, very familiar with that, but every piece of technology needs to be patched. So boards ought to understand, how are all the systems being patched? Where does the data flow in the organization? What data needs to be protected? The PII, the personally identifiable information. What are the regulations if they do, for example, business overseas, GDPR? There's other regulations out there. In the US, CMMC, Cybersecurity Maturity Model, for anybody in the defense supply chain. Boards ought to be asking those tough questions of, where is all the data? What are our most critical things? What would be the impact of losing the data or losing access? And completely shut down a company. What's being done to prevent those events from occurring? If something happens, what's being done to rapidly identify an incident, and not just wait till all the damage is done, but how do you rapidly identify, like, okay, there's a large amount of data moving, for example. There's lots of different ways to do that, or analyzing logs. And then looking at, is there a robust disaster recovery plan? And it doesn't matter what size. You could be a 5-person, very local business. You could be a big corporation. There needs to be a disaster recovery plan, and they ought to see that ought to be a rock solid plan. And that includes things like, how are employees notified? What's the communication plan? Who's in charge of communication? A lot of damage can be done after an event and make it a lot worse by just a bad communication plan. So you really challenge all of this. Run the tabletop exercise. Assume data is exfiltrated from the company. Okay, now what? What happens after that? What's the communication plan? Of course, understand what reporting requirements are there, but in a very stressful situation, that's not when you want to start figuring out what you're going to do. There's got to be a playbook ahead of time, and that's the disaster recovery plan.
And you're the author of a very popular book on security, cybersecurity for Main Street, which explains lots of things that people could do, organizations can do. I think one of the main targets for that group was smaller companies, so not public companies. Can you explain the difference of cybersecurity training for a board of directors of a private company? We've been talking about public companies, so what would be the differences aside from you don't have to do the filings with the
Yeah.
SEC?
Well, I think the fundamentals of cybersecurity are really all the same. It's any organization,
Hmm.
no matter what the size is potentially at risk. And smaller companies don't have as many defenses. So a lot of times when there's a big incident in the news, a lot of people falsely assume, okay, great, I'm not Target, I'm not Sony, I'm not Microsoft, they're not after me. That's not true at all. The majority of cyber attacks are just indiscriminate. Somebody sends out a million phishing emails and hey, somebody's going to click on it and the criminals are going to make some money. That's majority of what cybercrime looks like. And I would say, so when I wrote the book Cybersecurity for Main Street, I really think of it as a broader audience as well, because it really is for like Main Street is everybody. You may be the CEO of a big company, but learn the basics. And what I tried to do in the book is really just get to core concepts of cybersecurity. I wrote it a little bit to make it fun, like a fitness self-help book, 21 days, but it's one concept per day for 21 days and just kind of explaining in plain English, what's a complex password? Why do you need multi-factor authentication? I open it up with a cartoon to kind of break the ice. And that's what I find. Like you may have very distinguished people serving on a board who are experts in law, finance, whatever field they may come from. They may be former CEOs. So get your hands on something basic. I hope people will read my book, Cybersecurity for Main Street, but just you got to get over that hump and realize this is everyone's responsibility now. You cannot throw this responsibility over the fence to the tech nerds to take care of this. It's big government can't solve it, big tech can't solve it. This is an issue that really requires everyone's participation. So just find a way to
Yeah.
just start learning step by step.
Yeah. And a CEO might want to bring you in to actually go talk to their board of directors for cybersecurity training. How can they reach you? What's the first step?
Yeah, so I'm active on LinkedIn, Ann Westerheim on LinkedIn, also our website, ecaro.com. We were recently called in to do that. We did a training session, a 2-hour training session with a local board, just going through the cybersecurity basics and getting people to start thinking about what they need to cover. I'm a big fan of speaking to people about risk and things that relate to business and not going down kind of a rabbit hole of a lot of technical terms. But education is a really big part of my mission, of Ikaru's mission. So, yeah, reach out on LinkedIn or on our website.
Excellent. And thank you very much. A very insightful conversation about cybersecurity training for a board of
All
directors.
right. Thank you so much, Raj.